Well, hello and welcome, John. It's you hardly need any introduction to this ATG the podcast. You've been a well-known figure on the conference circuit for many years. Um, I think today you're probably best known as an ambassador for open access, but everyone who knows you know that your whole career has been a succession of enthusiastic advocacy for technology and used in transforming the scholarly process. So, very pleased to talk to you today, John. I've looked at your LinkedIn profile, and you state that you've had something like 8 different careers. It would be which of those careers meant most to you?
The enumeration of careers had actually came from a speech I was preparing on lifelong learning. And I was just kind of looking back and seeing that indeed my dad had pretty much 2 careers, maybe 3. And my grandparents, and it could be that we just don't know all the things they did. But, in terms of life's work and evidence of what they tried to impact they try to have on the world, you know, indeed, 8 careers. I'm now on my 8th. I say this is the one I will keep doing as long as my fingers can reach a keyboard and people are interested in what comes out of that communication
Yeah.
at the
So,
Charleston conference back in 2012.
uh,
And it was done at a plenary that was going to be about MOOCs. And the plenary was set for 4:30 in the afternoon. And as you know from the Charleston conference, by 4:30 in the afternoon, people are to get them
flagging.
awake and ready. So the organizers decided this was a perfect chance for me to replicate something I had done at the Fiesole conference in St. Petersburg in 2011, which is what's called a Pecha Kucha. And it's a Japanese, it was developed by a couple of architects who work in Japan. And it was basically to be like a haiku of PowerPoint to try to get people to deliver impactful messages in a short period of time. And there's a very rigorous format you have to follow. You get 20 slides, each one. In total, that means you've got 6 minutes and 40 seconds. But to be a Pecha Kucha, you have to allow them to advance automatically. And that's really hard to prepare because when you're doing the transition, if you come to the end of your comment and there's still 5 seconds to go on the slide you're on, it's like
Mm.
a dud. You really want it to really click. So it takes a lot of work to do one that's actually a Pecha Kucha. And when I presented that at the St. Petersburg Fiesole conference, they really liked it, so that they then introduced the concept, the general idea in Charleston conferences. And they call them shotgun sessions. They can't call them Pecha Kuchas because they do require only 20 slides and 6 minutes and 40 seconds. But they let the presenter choose the switch from one slide to the next. So by the trademark of Pecha Kucha, they're not allowed to call it that. But I gave that talk on lifelong learning, and it has a lot of elements that are sort of relevant to how you go about deciding what a career would be. It talks about some of the people that I followed when I thought about changing a career. Very much is like, what's the nexus between what you're good at and what you love doing? I happen to be one of these people who never had to study maths because I'd study the night before the exam and I'd get really high grades. It's just one of those things that came naturally to me. But it doesn't mean that I would love a job of accounting. I could do the math for sure,
Mm.
but it wouldn't be something I would particularly enjoy. And
Mm.
I love playing piano. But if you listen to me play, you'd say, no, you're not going to be a professional piano player. But it's so, you can have a hobby.
Mm.
It's something you love doing. But if it's going to be really a life's work, it should be this nexus between what you're good at and what you love doing. So I'm not sure that I have a perfect one, but I would say you can see that speech. It's on my LinkedIn page. So if somebody wanted to know what a Pecha Kucha was and how I went about looking at this
Mm.
nexus, so it does come up in terms of some other things we can talk about today,
Mm.
about DOAJ and that so forth, and open access.
You started, I believe, as one of your first careers was as a software architect, actually as a developer. So did you enjoy writing code?
Actually, I started at a time when they didn't talk about software as an architecture.
Mm.
And so, in a lot of ways, I mean, I started before there was a C language, for example. I started in 1968, and I dropped out of college during the tumultuous years of the late 60s and assumed I was going to be drafted. As it turned out, I wasn't. I got a high number on the draft. But in any case, I went to New York, and I thought I'd just be out of, be gone for 6 months and come back to school. And I ended up with joining a startup on Wall Street. And when I say startup, there were 300 people and a supercomputer in Boston. And of the 300, I was number 300. So that's not what you'd normally call a startup, but it was definitely a startup. And we were designing a new computer language. And just the idea of designing a language, I wasn't even just programming, and I hadn't programmed before. So a lot of it was I was just self-taught. And it just turned out the guy who was hiring me was 22. I didn't know it at the time, but he was a dropout himself. And he'd already had 22 people working for him. I mean, he was at the height of his career and he was only 22. I was 21. And, we didn't know necessarily what was hard, what was easy. We were just reading manuals and comparing notes and figuring out what it would be. One of the fellows on the team was 15, and he later went to MIT and became the co-inventor. His name is Bob Frankston, became the co-inventor of the spreadsheets on the Apple IIe. And very much what we were designing was a mainframe spreadsheet for financial analysis, so that somebody doing analysis of the stock market didn't need to have a programmer. They could program their own formulas and they could do charts, and they would be rows, columns, and pages would be the intersection of the formulas. So very much what the architecture is of a spreadsheet. So I ended up, I was learning, they didn't teach a single course in computer science when I went to college. And years later, I wrote to my college and I said, do you think you could give me credit for the courses I taught in graduate school? Because I did a couple of years of teaching in a graduate school. And, because I probably knew the subject. So I wrote a paper. I saw a course called Special Problems. That sounded like me in the phys ed department. And so I wrote a paper about integrating sports into a professional life. I learned how to do water training in a water vest because I was training for the Boston Marathon, and I had hurt my back, so I had to do my long distance training in a pool. And so, and my final exam was running the Boston Marathon. So, in any case, that was my start into programming. I'd have to say that programming, and this is true of a lot of people, that they'll be really excited about it in terms of they're constantly hitting new problems and trying to figure them out for the first 6 or 7 years, and then it kind of like it wears a little thin. And so I went from that point to being an independent software developer on, freelancer. Mm-hmm. And then after doing that for 7 years, I took my first corporate job, which was a management job with Computer Corporation of America. So I can tell you a little bit about that, but I'll let you lead this. What questions you want me to ask?
Sure. Well, did you enjoy management? How did you find being a manager?
Well, it is interesting. When I figured, because actually my management experience previous to joining Computer Corporation of America was mainly management in a volunteer organization. And I was on a national board of an organization that had groups in various cities across the U.S. involved in international relations. And I thought, oh, I'll get this corporate job. That'll be great, because then people will have to do what I tell them. Well, guess what? It turned out that having had skills of organizing volunteers turned out to be really important, because the first job I had, now I had the support of a remarkable woman, Burl Hartman, who was a vice president of product development at a leading enterprise software development firm that CCA had become. They were selling, mainframe database and communication systems and user languages, all one integrated package, to the likes of the NSA, the CIA, the Thames Television, Marks and Spencer, Coca-Cola Japan. I mean, really big international organizations. So for her to be the vice president of development, and then she gave me this job. So I had her backing, but I didn't have any staff. I had a $3 million project to complete in 2 or 3 years. And I had like 45 people working on it, but none of them worked for me. So indeed, I had to walk the halls. I had to really strengthen my ability to do informal influence. And that actually is actually really important, because formal systems, if they're not backed up by good informal systems, they tend to crack and strain. So I'd say that was an important life lesson for me in terms of management.
Hmm. Do you think that's where you got your skill from? I've noticed in your right up to the present day, a lot of what you do could be described as influencing or evangelization or working with people rather than sort of directly managerial. Very much around inspiring and enthusing. Do you think this is where you got that from?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it does have another side to it. I mean, I do
Mm.
constantly come up with great ideas about what other people should do. And, my children say that's some of my most endearing qualities. Not. But it is the case. And even when I look back at what have I contributed to open access, there are a lot of ideas that I've thrown out there and they just didn't go anywhere. And
Hmm.
so then I've got to ask myself, well, gee, what you can't just push an envelope, push a chord.
Hmm.
You have to figure out where's the resistance and what's it about? Is it structural? Is it something you yourself are doing in terms of where you're choosing to advocate what you're doing and what you're
Hmm.
asking people to do and not understanding their circumstance. And I know that came up, just a simple example of that, when I started jumping into open access. I came up with some great ideas about that would link what gold open access recommends and what green access recommends. And these are two camps that didn't tend to speak to each other. So it was immediately I drew some fire from people who were either strongly gold or strongly green that I was they would both agree finally that here's something they can agree on. Dove doesn't have a good idea about this, but one of the ideas was that indeed uh, you ought to be able to have from thinking about access from a whole standpoint, which is that you can't just bring up the new articles that are being published. Fundamentally, you have to get to a point where learners have access to the material that is in the backlist. And the backlist, the only path for things to come forward is green because it's already been published. So in that case, you need to be able to have an answer for both. And I had come up with this idea that maybe publishers who are solidly gold, in other words, that's their mission, not the ones who are just doing it as a business model, but the ones like PLOS and eLife and PureJ
Hmm.
and so forth, their mission is about open access. So if they're publishing a new article, couldn't they encourage the people who are cited to actually, archive their cited work?
Hmm.
Because then reading that new article will be more absorbed, it'd be more absorptive, if that's a word. It'd be easily digested by the reader
Hmm.
because the citations are readable.
Hmm.
So then I met with some scholarly communication librarians, one I particularly Zika Zafran, who was at Boston University. And she said, don't forget, there's only one of me and there's 2,000 of them. So if you're telling them they should go to their scholarly communication librarian to help move this, there's a bottleneck. And I said, well, maybe they'll hire more of you then. So that was an example of something that I pressed, but there wasn't a way it could be implemented in that way. So sometimes that's something I've had to take into account.
Sure. But one of the areas where I think you had most success was you spent some 10 years or so at a reference publisher, a very innovative reference publisher called Credo Reference, which originally started out as xrefer. And this is where what you were doing was in many ways similar to the work of a library. How did you get involved with Credo Reference?
That is an interesting thing. There was certainly a fit there between some natural instincts that I have and some of my background. But the actual pathway was that the founders, Adam Hodgkin and his colleagues, um, they had formed in 1999, just about the time that XML first came out, and they had the smart move to say, all right, we need, if you're going to do an online encyclopedia, you need XML. And they actually they're one of their lead developers was a fellow named Tim Bruce, and I discovered it when I started interviewing with them and then learning about him and his contribution. A lot of the insights that they did in Credo came from Tim Bruce, and his mother was a librarian. So there were no librarians working for this company. Having been the president and chief operating officer of Silver Platter back in the 90s, I knew the importance of bringing in librarians into an operation that's going to serve librarians. You don't want them to all be librarians because then you get the dark side of of some of the aspects of librarians. But you definitely have to have them as a key component of the voice. And Credo xrefer didn't have any librarians working for them, but it had this library influence. The people who brought me on they ran out of money in around 2002 and realized they were trying to be the next Google. And who knows, somebody could have been the next Google. You never know who could have been. It didn't happen. And the new investors were Bela Hadvani, who had been the co-founder of Silver Platter. Mm-hmm. And I had worked for him for several years at Silver Platter. And so he brought me on board as a candidate to be the CEO of their first CEO for xrefer. And Bela didn't particularly know that my mother had been a library researcher for Encyclopedia Britannica. So growing up, my life was all about, my mother would bring up at the dinner table interesting questions that came up because Encyclopedia Britannica had this unique feature that they introduced that was to get over every sales objection, which is they'd knock on the door and the person would answer and they'd say, "We got this encyclopedia." And they'd say, "Yeah, but what about," and they'd yell upstairs to their uncle, "What's that subject you're interested in?" And he'd say, I don't know, something like semantic disintegrity protection. And, "Oh, well, what do you have on semantic disintegrity?" Well, of course, we don't have anything on that. But guess what? If you buy Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll get 50 research credits, and you can send them into Encyclopedia Britannica. And we have a bunch of library researchers who will give you an annotated bibliography on that subject.
Wow.
And of course, they typed them up in 7-part copies so they would have possible uses for a new article if anybody wanted to do an article eventually when they fed it over to the editorial department.
Well, what's remarkable about Credo Reference, it was founded, you mentioned it was commercially sort of, there were problems, the commercial problems, but actually I can imagine it must have been difficult because it was founded just around the same time as Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia started in 2001, Credo Reference 2003, about that time. So how did Credo manage to survive as a commercial encyclopedia operation when confronted by Wikipedia, which sent most of the commercial encyclopedias out of business?
Let's say, first of all, I'm a big fan of Wikipedia, and I have always been. And so, indeed, one of my first assignments is where I had to appear at a meeting of the ALA where there was a panel of the reference user services. It's the major subgroup for reference librarians. And on that panel was going to be Jimmy Wales, myself, the head of Thomson's main new, they changed their name to Cengage, but it was had a big reference system. And then there was 4 or 5 other specialty reference systems. So there's 6 people on this panel. And it was really interesting because first of all, I learned a lot about Wikipedia because in preparing for that, I decided to test out a few things and discovered what was unique about Wikipedia compared to a system. One of the things that Wikipedia people don't often recognize is there's an irony in the sense that it gains its authority by declaring itself to be unauthoritative. So if you write an article and it has only references to Wikipedia, it'll be dinged by the system. So this is not an authoritative article because there are no authoritative citations. Now, authoritative doesn't mean that it's true. It just means it comes from an authority and you can then question that authority because it could be a biased authority. And indeed, you get a lot of those things that come up, especially as you look at post-colonial world where are you just documenting the well-documented because they could document easily the behaviors of the colonists? Or do you want to document the ephemeral and very difficult to gather world of the people who were standing up against it? So there's a lot of really serious problems that they know that they're trying to deal with, but they declare themselves not to be authoritative. And I remember watching the World Cup when Zidane was expelled from the final, and 5 minutes after, I'm looking at on Wikipedia to see who Zidane is, and it says Zidane, whose international career in football ended at the World Cup meeting, that happened just 5 minutes before. So there was no way that Credo could live up to that kind of currency for sure.
Immediacy. Yeah.
And but in fact, there was a number of queries that I would do where Wikipedia would get it right, and Credo would get it wrong. I mean, completely wrong. And a lot of that was because there were cases where people don't know the right answer and they just promote the wrong answer. And one of them is about the equinox and how long, what's the definition of an equinox. So some of this also came up. It's because I was on a panel at Wikimedia at the Wikimania conference in 2005, and Jimmy Wales. It was just about the time that Jimmy Wales was. Somebody had evaluated, compared Wikipedia with Encyclopedia Britannica, and found that Wikipedia was almost as good as Britannica. And Jimmy was giving sort of lecture to his minions. You really need to be careful about this because, yes, these are some of our better written articles, but that's not necessarily going to be matching up. And one of the people on the panel was from World Book. And Jimmy, talking to his audience, says, introducing Paul Grizzo, I think his name is, who was either the CEO or the chief editor at World Book. And he said, Jimmy described his own experience growing up. And he said, World Book was a big part of my life growing up. And so immediately that brought up in my mind, and indeed World Book has this motto over their editorial room. It's really hard to write things that are easy to read. And if you think of what presenting information to a 12-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, which is what World Book is doing, you need to be really good. So then it raised in my mind, well, gee, what is the audience of Wikipedia? What's the audience of Credo? And I decided at that point, with further investigation, of course, that the sort of sweet spot of what we would try to be is the high-level undergraduate education. So we wouldn't go into the graduate schools of nanophysics and various technical subjects. We wouldn't go so low as to be sort of World Book. We would really pick the sweet spot being the higher level education, and that brought me into really doing research among the liberal arts colleges in the U.S., comparing those to some of the different kinds of college. You have different college system in the U.K., so it was often interesting to see how that differed. So it's always an interesting sort of challenge to get the focus right, but that's where the origin of that focus came from.
I think you've touched on something very interesting here because, like you, I'm a great fan of Wikipedia, but Wikipedia just represents one reference model among several. And I remember Credo Reference as being remarkable in that, if I remember correctly, what it gave you was the content from several different reference sources for you to compare. And there was no attempt to try and harmonize them. There was almost certainly going to be disagreement among those sources. But actually, I thought it was quite a valuable educational resource. Whose idea was that?
Well, no, indeed. It's depending on the purpose. So you could have, if your first purpose is to be the initial impression of where things are at, these different subjects, you certainly want to be able to cover schools of thought. So if you're dealing with a particular philosophical issue, you want to be able to say, well, there are multiple schools of thought, and they do this, and the people who don't like this say this. And for many years, while I was CEO of xrefer, then called Credo, I would go to library. I loved going to library schools and talking to reference classes, because those students had usually gotten a master's degree in something else or had been working at something else before they picked up. Very few people go immediately to library school. Some do, but very few. And so these classes were made up of people who were deeply curious at a high level, in a graduate school level, and certainly excellent undergrad. So they were perfect people to ask. If you had a system on your shoulder, first of all, I'd give a little bit of introduction to people about the whole history of the reference interview. And Gail Schlachter was such an important, advisor to me in terms of description of a lot of the 100 years of literature that there's been about the reference interview, the nexus between two unknowns. The user doesn't know what's available, and the librarian doesn't know what the user wants. And so the interview is meant to be able to take into account some context. What institution are we in? What does this person look like? But don't just make assumptions and everything else. And then how do they narrow it down to when somebody says, what do you have about fish?
Yeah.
And they may mean whales. So in any case, that interview, what I would present as a thought question for people, for these students, is if you had a system on your shoulder that could act like the system librarian, the reference librarian, what things would it do? And so, like one is, gee, what's a contrarian view? And we bounced around a little bit. If we could have a button that would be, show me a contrarian view, that would be a great reference question to be able to have. And doing it in the system, that's a little too vague. But we certainly got a lot of ideas about how we wanted this experience to be. But I have to say that actually the very initial thing, as Credo xrefer was when I found it, had this element of serendipity. And I think that serendipity is such an important thing in terms of, number one, it's the fundamental part of what is Ranganathan's third law, which is to anthropomorphize. Books are trying to find people. Means that there's a purpose for a book, and if you let enough people see it, the people that the book was looking for will find it. So it was used to say, gee, you ought to have open stacks, because somebody looking for Dostoevsky is going to find Dos Passos, and they'd never heard of Dos Passos. He's a famous travel writer of the Middle East, and a great writer. But if you're all, and you'd only have that if you were wandering through the stacks, right? So that Ranganathan used that as an example of how the cataloging system and everything else needs to help books find their proper reader. And so when I remember doing my very first query on xrefer, and it was on Dinka. Now, Dinka, I don't know what you'd think it means, but I knew it had a very specific meaning because my wife teaches English as a second language. And among her 14 students were 14, they're called the Lost Boys, but let me tell you, they don't like it. They knew they weren't lost. They were child soldiers thrown in, being ethnically cleansed from their families and everything else. And the girl among them especially didn't like that term, the Lost Boys, but they represent about 2,000 refugees who came into the U.S. in the 1990s. And so Gloria had them as high school students. And she got even though they have no written language in their own language, Dinka, they know French and they know Swahili and they're getting to learn English. She got every one of them to pass the standardized high school tests and being tested by other teachers. It was so important to her that they do well. So I was really interested in the Dinka. So I looked up Dinka, and indeed a bunch of things came up about sub-Saharan metaphysics and tribes and different kinds of politics. And then there was Doris Day. Doris Day. What does Doris Day have to do with the Dinka? Right? And then you click. That's amazing. You have to click on it when you see Doris Day along with the sub-Saharan tribes, right? And so you click on it, and it turns out that she and Jimmy Durante sang a song, Dinka Dinka Doo, right? Now you might say, well, this is. I mean, if you're doing a search system for patents, this is annoying to have too much of these Doris Day things coming in. Yeah. But if you're preparing a speech on sub-Saharan metaphysics, maybe you need a joke to start your who knows. So anyway, the idea that it's the utility of uselessness in some ways, that serendipity expands to allow you to find things that are unexpected. And that was my first search on it. Almost that search by itself won me over to saying, this is a neat idea.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in serendipity. I don't need converting. Do you think when Wikipedia became wildly successful about sort of several years after it had started, many people started, you felt that many people said that online references is no longer necessary, that Wikipedia has just replaced everything. Do you think there's still a place for online reference?
Well, as I said before, Wikipedia gains its authority from the sites it sorts. It's the sites it references.
Yeah.
So indeed, actually, one of the things I did at Credo is I set up a relationship with Wikipedia where we would provide free access to Credo to their 300 most prolific editors. But they had to first find their local library to see if their local library had it. And remarkably, a bunch of, you get to see, Wikipedia, everything is transparent. So you get to see everything that everybody said about anything. And so you could see people reacting to this offer, and they'd say, gee, I didn't know my local library had reference books, online reference book, they meant.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so, gee, that's fabulous. I didn't even know that, right? And
Yeah.
and so we had this in place for a couple of years, and then there were some changes in management, and a person who was in charge of sales felt like, oh no, we can't be giving away to these 300 unknown people. We don't know who they are. Right. We don't know who they are. Some of them might be directors of libraries who, in fact, might buy Credo. So
Mhm.
don't cut it off. But it was,
Mhm.
sometimes people follow a narrow channel, and so I think
Mhm.
it was cut off. And then and later, indeed, the library program that was set up by Wikipedia by Jake Orlowitz was a fabulous set of things, which a bunch of publishers jumped into because they recognized that being cited in Wikipedia is actually a
Yeah.
benefit, you're not leaking your crown jewels if you get people to mention you in Wikipedia. That's this.
Yeah.
So the Munder publishers came on board to the programs that Jake put together. But I had done that for a couple of years before he came onto Wikipedia,
Mhm.
and then it was shut down by new management. But
Mhm. Yeah, I noticed that you're absolutely right. I think Oxford and several other big reference publishers provide their content to Wikipedia, and you see references to the Dictionary of National Biography and so on in Wikipedia.
now you mentioned the end of reference. A lot of times people talk about the end of reference and so forth.
Mhm.
And I've been on a couple of committees. Thankfully, although I'm not a librarian, definitely
Mhm.
not. Maybe I was supposed to be if I'd started early enough. But in any case, um, the need that people have to navigate complex information scapes, that is like accelerating. That's not decelerating. And so whether the person is a librarian or it's an IT specialist or whatever it is, and as people get older, the needs get greater. The need for people to have complex things explained to them for their benefit
Yeah.
by people who have empathy and understanding not just of the current problem, but where are things going. And that if that doesn't define what librarians work on, I think it's clearly a need. I don't see that need going away at all.
It's very reassuring to hear such a clear endorsement. Can we move on to probably what you're best known for today, which is your work with open access? You've been involved with DOAJ for several years. How did you get involved with open access in the first place?
It's interesting. I'd gone well past retirement age at Credo. It was a 65, and I was up to now 68, and
Mhm.
I'd been there a long time, and I'd already passed on the reins of leadership to Mike Sweet, who was
Yeah.
doing a great job, and they didn't need another voice. I mean, for a good period of time, I was the voice of sort of visionary of future, and I would
Mhm.
give descriptions of what you could do with the next library and
Yeah.
reference system. There are some really good semantic examples that have not been done yet could be by an aggregator of reference. And just a simple question of asking, gee, Charles Dickens lived on John Street in London.
Mhm.
And what are the famous works and places and people and events that take place? So I did write an article about that and presented it at Charleston conference about what
Mhm.
you could do with a reference system if you use, basically Tim Berners-Lee model of the semantic web, but just nail it down to what you would do with a reference system. It's a much simpler problem to solve.
Mhm.
And you can do amazing things that still haven't been done, like show a Google map of Dickens and the Clerkenwell riots, which took place just half a mile from where he lived, right?
Mhm.
For universal suffrage, which when I wrote the article, I thought that included women, but it didn't. In any case, and who are some of the famous people who were going to the British Library's famous
Yeah. British
reference
Museum. Yeah.
center,
Yeah.
at the British Library.
Yeah.
Who were some of the same people who were going there the same time he was? And
Mhm.
and you don't want to know everybody. You don't not want to know the census of London at that time.
Mhm.
That wouldn't be very interesting. But knowing people who are famous enough to
Mhm.
be in a reference aggregation,
Mhm.
that would be a pretty neat way to explore the world of Charles Dickens.
Mhm.
I did a strategic workshop for 10 days in India with Satya, who is the head of informatics. And it turned out that they had a discovery tool that was even more broader reach than the document delivery service of the British Library. It was significantly broader than the OCLC's search. Now it was abstract only, so it wasn't full text search, and most of their extension was over OCLC's, for example, was in the open access arena. So as part of the strategy questions that I asked, what's to keep OCLC from just taking your list and now they've got the same list you do? And they said, oh no, it is not easy to follow this long tail of open access journals because they come and go. They don't always follow standards. They might not be identified with the right metadata. It takes a lot of manual work to be able to do that. How do they increase inclusivity without creating a higher price to be involved? So even things like the cost of DOIs or the cost of archiving and things like that. So DOAJ gets into lowering the barriers that should be lowered while keeping high the barriers in ethics and process and standards that should be high. So that's very much what DOAJ is about. So when I think when I'm flying back from that, it was in 2015, April, that I went to see Satya in informatics. Satya, by the way, was the person who, when I joined Silver Platter, within a few months, when I interviewed at Silver Platter with Bela Hatvani, the chairman, I asked him, this is a consulting question kind of asked, and I'd come out of a management consulting career at that point, my fifth career. And I asked him this, well, who are the critical thinkers in this field? And Bela said, well, there is this Indian guy named Ranganathan. So I, search it out. And 2 months later, I was in London online and Satya was there. And I asked him about Ranganathan. And when I got back to my desk, there was a copy of it, Ranganathan's 5 Laws on my desk. And it became a really important book for me. So that years later, when I was at Credo, one of the first papers I wrote as CEO of Credo was with Michelle Clunan, who is the director, the head of the library program at Simmons, one of the elite library programs in the U.S. And so she and I wrote an article for Library Journal on what would Ranganathan think of the internet. And I suggested it should be called "Is Google Against the Law?" But they actually, as we were being reviewed, because it wasn't peer reviewed, but it was seriously reviewed in fact, it was reviewed by the chief editor. Mm-hmm. Google Scholar and Google Books and Google Print all came out in January of 2004, I guess it was. Mm-hmm. And, we had to rewrite the article because how could you talk about, what would Rangan think about the internet and you don't deal with these whole new Google things that had come out. So we rewrote it and we focused it on the third law. It was an article I had thought of writing when I was at Silver Platter, and I first read about Ranganathan. But then I had the chance to write it along with, Michelle Clunan was the lead author, because there's no way the Library Journal would have taken just that paper from me alone at that point. So she liked the idea. She had come from more of a museum background. Mm-hmm. And so to write a paper, and not a particularly technical person. So for her to write an article about technology and for me to be able to write anything in Library Journal was a great combination. So, and she and her husband's an expert on the history of books. Mm-hmm. And both of them are really good friends and advisors to me. So, so anyway, that was my path into open access. Mm-hmm. Is that coming back from that India workshop, I read Peter Suber's book on open access. Mm-hmm. It was published by MIT in 2012, and it's available open access, and I was able to download it onto my iPhone or my iPad, and I read it on the plane home. And Peter Suber is somebody I had known of for many years, for 20, 30 years at that point, because his discipline was philosophy of the law. And in 1985, Douglas Hofstadter ran a column in Scientific American in which he referred to a game that Peter Suber had developed called Gnomic. And it explores the reflexivity of the law, because it's a reflexive system. There are laws, and then there's laws about laws. And so he wanted to have a game that would explore reflexivity. And so he had a game with 50 rules, and the purpose of the game is you propose a change to the rules. I ended up not only buying the electronic version and buying one in print, and then I bought a case of the book because I often hand them out to people who are coming into open access, because there is backed up by a website. I often recommend it because I describe him as the parliamentarian of open access. And I almost never come out with something that I haven't run by Peter to say, am I missing something here?
Yeah.
And very often he will say, oh, that's very much like a paper I wrote in 2006. So he too sometimes suggests things that, that nobody does. One area that I do want to talk about is my beginning to work with Directory of Open Access Journals.
Sure.
And what I'm doing now with them. So first of all, I mentioned that I started going to conferences. I was willing to do work for anybody who had something specific that I could work on. And for a couple years, about a year and a half, I did some work for MDPI, which is a rather controversial publisher. They were declared to be a predatory publisher by one particular librarian. I'm not going to bother mentioning his name because I think it was irresponsible to have just one person making these decisions. And he decided to declare them predatory. And 14 months later, with one tweet, he said, I've reversed my decision on this. But in those 14 months, a huge amount of damage was done to their reputation. And people can have different ideas about them, but I describe them myself as sort of like the Walmart of scholarly publishing. They've got a standard of quality. The peer review is all done by the academics in the principally U.S. and U.K. and Europe. And they do have a very specific view of not reviewing for importance. And when you review for importance, you're actually trying to create the reason that subscription publishers review for importance. It's because the subscription renewals is the golden goose that just pays over and over and over again. And there's still, so if you have monopoly control of renewals, that can fund a lot of all of your other work in your scholarly communication enterprise. So the ones that are publishing purely open access, they don't have that as an opportunity. So some of them try to drive it up just to drive their impact factor up. And MDPI has been really solid on the fact that they want to review for scientific rigor, and but not for importance. And so there's been a bias that's been recognized in the subscription publishing system, a bias against negative results, because why? That's not newsworthy. Who cares? It could be that you didn't have a big enough sample size. So there's important scientific issues as to why negative results have to be looked at carefully. But replication studies, you studied something that's already been done and you discovered the same thing. Well, apparently I've heard one speaker from the Center for Open Science say that there were 12 studies on Tamiflu and only one was published. The other 11 were negative. So, how much money was spent internationally and still is on Tamiflu, when in fact, if replication studies had been published, maybe they wouldn't have been. So in any case, it's often something that's not published because it's not newsworthy. And interdisciplinary studies, and in minor disciplines, those are both difficult to find the proper review. So those are, I think there's 5 altogether of biases of the subscription system. And MDPI has been really solid on those principles. And so I worked with them on a program that they have of a free discount that they offered to libraries. And so in short order, I was able to sign up 168 libraries from around the world. And so that I think that's what caught the attention of Lars Barshog when I saw him. I met Lars at one of the OSI meetings in 2016. He's the founder of the Directory of Open Access Journals. And if any of the audience doesn't know about Lars Barshog, he was not just the founder of DOAJ. He founded DOAB, the Directory of Open Access Books. He founded AOPEN, which those two are combined now into one organization. He founded Think, Check, Submit. He was involved a lot in the development of the approach to the SCOS program that was the framework for providing sustainable income from libraries to the infrastructure providers. And DOA, he backed away from that when it looked like DOAJ might become a pilot, because he thought it'd be unethical for him to be setting up the framework and also then being the pilot. So he stepped back from that. He's an incredibly ethical person in terms of those kinds of questions. And so when I had the chance to, I saw him again at the COASP in Copenhagen, and I just sort of laid out the pages of the logos of the 168 universities that had signed up for MBTI's program. And I said, gee, is there something we can do together? And so he got back to me and said, boy, maybe we could combine your enthusiasm for open access and your clear networking ability to help with this really hard problem, which is the U.S. is a very strong supporter when they're totaled up as the total contributor. But indeed, as I did later analysis of this, if you do it per capita, or more importantly, per GDP, the U.S. of the 22 countries in 2019 that gave money to DOAJ of anything more than £5,000, the U.S. was dead last. And the one that was next one was 2 or 3 times of what the U.S. was. So Canada was 3 times the U.S. Northern Europe, that's where Lars and started at Lund University. So that was 7 times the U.S. Western Europe as a group was also 7 times. So I recognized that indeed, and Lars had recognized that the money coming from the U.S. was far less than it needed to be in order to provide a sustainable support. So I was caught at that spot. I took on that job with Lars in February of 2020. 2 weeks later, the shutdown occurred for the pandemic. So none of us knew that was happening. And that upped the ante for how important this job was for the open access movement in general and for DOAJ in particular. So I had a lot of the things that I was working on in 2017, 18, and 19, in particular this model that's called maximum dissemination. And it's a model where it's addressing a difficult problem in open access, which is what do you do with humanities and society journals that are in the humanities and some social sciences. So there are no funding agencies, or the ones that do, the money is run out by the time they write an article. They can flip to open access and eliminate marginalization of the reader, but they'll just be contributing, switching that with marginalization of the author or the author's institution. So if they go to an APC model, if they go to a diamond model where there's some endowment fund or whatever else, then they've got this problem that's talked about as we've got the Samaritans and the freeloaders, and we're going to have too many freeloaders overwhelm the Samaritans, and so how is this sustainable? And so I'd spent a year collecting information, pros and cons from academics and librarians and open access zealots and open access opponents about what about if you just stayed with your subscription system, but disseminated automatically the author's manuscript. And then basically everybody gets access to the author's ideas as reviewed by, and reacted to by peer review. So the peer reviewers have said this is good stuff as long as these changes are made. And very often publishers actually promote the idea to authors. You should distribute sometimes they ask for an embargo, but after the embargo, you should distribute your author's manuscript. You can build up your readership by doing that. And so this idea is basically stay with your subscription system. It's bringing in good revenue that you're using for membership development and diversity, equity, and inclusion in your conferences. And that money is really useful. And so you can even stay with all your sales and marketing team. You can still have transformative agreements if you want to try that. But you could almost very quickly just be able to say, all right, from now on, instead of the block, the paywall, which says, no, you can't have this. You get this interstitial message that says, no, you can't get the version of record. And here's why, and here's what we're going to give you, and here are the rules about using this. Make sure you cite. Because if you did that, the day that it's published, somebody clicks on the DOI or an URL or is picked up by Google Scholar, they get one or the other seamlessly. So I presented that model a couple of times in 2019. But then taking on this assignment with DOAJ, for me, it was actually a dream opportunity to be able to be of help. And I decided that it would be far too confusing for me to, on one hand, be saying, "Oh, well, don't switch your subscription system, stay with it and do this other model." But make sure you give money to DOAJ. It would have been, I would have gotten confused. So I purposely put on the back burner any discussion about maximum dissemination.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have a excellent community manager in the name of Katrine Sundsbro from Norway. And Lars has passed off the baton to his successor,
mm-hmm.
a wonderful Joanna Ball, who, they could have chosen any number of gold open access micro publishers who had, proven a good model, and then they got acquired by Taylor and Francis or Wiley or Elsevier or whatever, and then they're looking for a job, and they would know all about BOII, and they know about publishing, and they know about open access, and they know about OASPA. They could have picked somebody like that. I am so glad that they picked somebody whose 20 years experience was as a librarian, not only in the UK at Suffolk, but also as a director at Rockslide. Joanna Ball had just been president of UKSG.
Yeah.
So her librarianship roots are really strong. And so now I'm moving into a role with DOAJ as an advisor to their core team, and passed off all the recruitment of additional support through the consortium, mainly through consortia, onto Katrine. And so this gives me an opportunity to come back to some of these other ideas that I've been working on earlier. And I'm really excited about it, and they're very supportive. So I really appreciate the chance I have with them. And I can also do something that's way off, completely out of the box in terms of maximum dissemination. So.
Sure, we'll look forward to seeing your involvement with the DOAJ, and I've no doubt that that you'll come up with more innovative ideas and ways of participating and encouraging the open access movement in years to come. So it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, John, today. It's really been fascinating to learn more about your background, but even more exciting to realise that you still have lots to give, still have lots to present the scholarly community. So I look forward to maybe let's talk again in a sort of in a year or two, and let's see where you've got to next.
Great. Good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.